My name is Allie Jones, and I'm Executive Director of Teachers to Teachers Global. Our mission is to build quality math education programs through collaborative partnerships that drive greater social justice. Thank you for joining us today for another conversation about math for anti-racism. For the next half hour, we're going to talk about why we started this campaign in the first place. Why math for anti-racism? And what does that even mean? So this Math for Anti-Racism campaign is about how quality math education helps to build both the critical thinking skills and the emotional skills needed to practice anti-racism in daily life. Practicing anti-racism is hard because it requires more than just not being racist. It requires actively working to challenge it and dismantle it in yourself, in others, and in society. It's really hard work, and at least in my personal experience, it never gets any easier, but it does keep getting more worth it. I'd like to introduce my teammate, Callie Herring. Callie leads T2T Global's education partnerships and is currently based on the coast of Ecuador. She studied elementary education, has a master's degree in bilingual education, and is a Teach for America alumna as well. She has taught in Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and some of the most rural schools in the United States. I'm grateful for the unique perspective she brings to this work every day, and have asked her to help us reflect on how Math for Anti-Racism connects with some of her own experiences as a program leader and classroom educator. Hi, Callie. So the thing I really want to dig into right now is how math can be a place where we talk about the hard things in life, which I know is something that you and I both feel really passionate about. It's been one thing I've been thinking about a lot since my conversation with Shelley Jones 2 weeks ago. And I think there's this one quote from her that I want to share that can kind of ground our conversation for today. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to read this quote from her, and then we can talk about what it makes us think about. So when she was talking about her students, she said they should be ready to critique the social order because they already know some things are not fair. They don't know why. They don't know what they can do about it. And some teachers are afraid that, well, if I'm teaching elementary, isn't that too heavy? No. Don't you think if kids are experiencing heavy in their neighborhoods and at home, they're going to experience the heavy, but we're going to help them to see that there are some things that you could do about it, that there are some people you can write to. You can write to politicians or the councils in your hometown. So we're not going to introduce anything that's so heavy that they leave without some type of answer, but it doesn't also mean that you're going to get an answer in 45 minutes. It's a way for them to discuss things that they're already thinking about because they see it and they hear it. They see it on TV, on the internet, whatever they watch, probably not TV, but on the internet. They hear about it at the dinner table. There's not a kid that hasn't heard about George Floyd. There is not. If we don't talk about it, then we're not doing the math justice, social justice. So for me, that's particularly powerful because the part about the dinner table and that conversation is always one that I really wanted to have in the classroom as well. So what are the kinds of things that quote makes you think about as you reflect on just your own experiences?
Sure. Yeah, I really love that we're bringing this quote into the conversation right now because it immediately sparked a lot of memories for me when I was hearing Shelley discuss it, and everything that she said reminded me really strongly of one experience in particular in my classroom when I was teaching 4th grade at Weldon Elementary School in North Carolina. And my students, we all lived very close to each other in a neighborhood a few blocks away from the school. And with my 4th graders, we did a unit studying and learning about Malala. And while we were in this process, I got a little bit of feedback that didn't I think teaching 4th graders about an assassination attempt on a girl for trying to go to school was a little bit heavy for 9-ish-year-olds. And my response was no, because every single student in my classroom, the summer actually before the school year, there was a student from our community murdered who was family and friends with my students. And, there were retaliation happened on the street in our neighborhood right by the school. And so everybody knew somebody who they were all living a very similar experience and could identify a lot with what happened to Malala. And what we actually found was that together exploring this and creating a space to really talk about what happened to her and then what she did with it afterwards helped to spark hope, because they were able to see that kids in other parts of the world, while their contexts are very different, there's things about their lived experiences that are similar. And being able to see the way that Malala turned something really horrific into something that is even bigger than herself and her community, but for girls and for education everywhere, turned out to be a really powerful experience for my students. And to speak to that a little bit more, my class was a 3-4 transition class, which meant that the students were working to complete 3rd and 4th grade reading standards all at the same time in the same year. And on paper, the students in my class had reading levels between kindergarten and 2nd and lower 3rd grade. And I had students who were one in particular, she was so passionate about learning more about Malala. She was so inspired that she convinced her mom to buy a novel for her that was on a 6th grade reading level. And she read it, and it was one of the first novels that she ever read, and she loved it. And she had such success with it because she really identified with everything that it was talking about. So on paper, she shouldn't have been able to do that. But whenever we explored a context that was meaningful to her and connected to her own life as well, it was an example of just how capable our kids really are.
Yeah, and what you can tap into when you really know your students and have the time and the space to understand their lived experiences and what they're walking into that classroom with. Because I just really think that if you can show kids the connection between tapping into what they love and what they're passionate about, and also learning, creating change and traction in life, you can really generate a movement that could change the world. And that could be really, really powerful, especially for girls.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And something really neat that happened too, as we were wrapping up our unit on Malala, we got to host a visitor from Mexico who was a teacher for Enseña Mexico, or Teach for Mexico. And so she spent a week living with me in my home and spending all day, every day with me and my students in our classroom. And she was able to share with us a lot of experiences from her own community and context as well, about what it's like for kids to go to school. What does that mean? What are the struggles to even having access to education that are experienced in her community? And so it was really, we were able to explore 3 very different places in the world together: our own community context, the context of Miss Anna and her classroom in Mexico, and then Malala's experience, and be able to find similarities and differences between those 3 places. And I think there's something really powerful in that, and being able to say, what I'm not alone in this, and that, we have really unique differences. And then there's also shared humanity, shared commonalities across so many different contexts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think somewhere in that quote, Shelley said something about how there's not a kid in the world that hasn't heard about George Floyd. And I think that's so true. And part of what I've been really reflecting on for teachers is how hard it must be to have that kind of a conversation virtually with your students that you're so used to connecting with in person. And that we're all figuring out how to have those hard conversations just normally. And it's that much harder virtually, and still that much more important, because no matter really where you are in the world, there are these kinds of things happening. And the United States is not the only place where something like the killing of George Floyd happens. So I think it's a really great point that you make, that students everywhere are asking these questions and having these conversations and looking at the experiences that they're having in their own lives, and teachers are figuring out how to respond to that. And the more that we can support them in navigating that process, the better. And I think that's one place where teachers to teachers really can come in and partner with teachers to best navigate that, and also couple it with learning goals. So what are some kind of experiences from work with teachers to teachers that you've had in the field? Because you've been in the field for, at least over a year at this point in Ecuador. And I don't know if you have a story that you could share with us.
Yeah, there's a couple that come to mind. One that is really powerful, um, and connects back to the lived experience of students in different communities as well. So thinking about where I am now in Ecuador versus the community that I have called my home for so many years in North Carolina, um, and just the same story of different contexts but similar challenges, and the work looks very similar in different places. um, there's a community that we partner with here in Ecuador called Santo Domingo de Ansele, and this is a Black community, a mostly Black community along a river in the northern part of the country that is extremely remote and has been really cut off from the rest of Ecuador, and in many ways the rest of the world historically. Even lack of things like access to cell phone service. And just within the last couple years, they've gotten an info center and have a wired internet connection for the first time. And so just access beyond this community has been really, really limited. Even to get into the community, it takes travel on a motorized canoe along the river to be able to get there. And so this is a community where leadership is incredible, and where the challenges that are faced by the citizens of Ecuador who are a part of this community are also really extreme. And so we had the opportunity to partner with education leaders to explore a problem that their community was facing, which has to do with contamination of the river and contamination of their community in general. So they live by the river. The water is life. And so it's life for everyone, and even more so in this community where everything relies on the river. And so teachers and community leaders noticed that contamination was happening, and it was really impacting the way their way of life, and they wanted to do something about it. And so we were able to come in as T2T Global and host an institute with some professors from the University of Maryland, and we were able to participate in some action research together where we were able to support education leaders in the community to learn more about the problem, what was happening, and how was it affecting the people there. And then what was the role of education and of the school in this, and particularly what could be the role of math teachers in this. And so we worked with students and teachers alike that week to find the math around the garbage problem. So there's not any kind of like landfill or sanitary landfill or trash collection or services or anything like that. And so what the community currently has is a big hole in the ground where trash goes. And so whenever that rains, it floods, and it goes everywhere, and it's in the river. And there's a lot of really complex challenges around this. And so exploring together through math, what actually is the problem? How can we define the problem? And then what can we do about it? And so teachers and students worked really, really hard on a lot of really interesting things to be able to better inform themselves, to be able to better inform their entire community about what was going on, and then also, and most importantly, advocate for themselves in that moment. And so we had this experience in June of last year, and then in July we hosted a teacher trip back to this community, and during the teacher trip had the opportunity to be witnesses of an experience, an open house that the school put on, where every single class presented what they were learning through this whole process. And they presented it not only to all of their peers in the school, but to the entire community. They opened the open house up to the entire community and convinced the local government leader from the Ministry of the Environment to be present as well. And it was so beautiful to watch class after class after class of students standing up and sharing what they were learning and calling for something better. And at the end, when the 11th grade class was sharing, a student took the microphone and he turned and faced directly to the government leader from the Ministry of the Environment. And he said, so Mr. Official, as you've heard, we now know that throwing our trash in the river is not an okay solution, because it impacts life for not only us, but the rest of the world. And then we also know that burning our trash is not an okay solution because it's causing contamination that's impacting our health and the health of the environment. And what we currently have isn't working. So now what we ask to you is, like, what are we supposed to do with it? We have trash. What are we supposed to do with it? What we've been doing, we now know that this isn't okay. And he handed the microphone to the government official and returned to his seat. And it was just such a moment of strength, where learning was brought to life in a really real way. And while it's a really powerful story, it also doesn't stop there. Like, the work is really hard, and it doesn't, like, we would fool ourselves to think that we put a lot of effort in and there's always an immediate payoff for that. Because I think it's also important to note that the learning process and the ability of the students to be able to stand up and speak their truths in that space is one thing. And also, it's been a year now. It was a year ago in July, and nobody's come back. A lot of promises were made on the government's end at that time about how some technicians were going to come and they were going to ensure that a safe landfill was truly constructed in the community. Nobody's been back. And so that's the reality. And that means, though, that we don't give up, but that we're together with the community in this for the long haul to keep going. So they have a long history of overcoming challenge after challenge, and that continues to be the story.
Yeah, I think there's something in the idea of the fact that, like, progress is hard and slow, and change is something that is fought for. And there is a persistence there that's required to achieve it, and a lot of partnerships and collaboration that is required as well. And all of that is part of math class and succeeding in math class, right? So this idea that we want students to be wrestling with hard problems, we talk about this all the time, but math is not a worksheet, right? And, like, math is complex, and it's bigger and it's deeper. And to really get something out of math class, you want to actually wrestle with the why behind the problem and actually have the time and the space to do that. And that there is value in that process, and other learnings that come out of it along the way. And the learnings are constant, and we keep going. And the more that people that we can bring into that process, and the more students in the room that we can get collaborating, the more opportunities I think that we have to build knowledge together and achieve what we are all working towards that much faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I think back about the experience, it truly is a combination of, like, the context is a real life context, but that is very meaningful to every single person in that community. And the math is complex and rigorous as well. And so the things that students were doing, they were putting on their rain boots and trekking out to the dump that currently exists, and taking measurements and estimations and thinking about, like, what is the actual problem to be able to define it. Students were developing surveys and going out to survey the community about what was the way that they were currently disposing of their trash, and then turning that real data into something in their classrooms and working with it to be able to further define the problem. And so the math learning happening, and it extends beyond just math, right? This is something that was able to touch all subjects, and provided an opportunity for the students from the school to collaborate, all the way from the students who are in their last year of high school to the pre-K and kindergarten class, working together to solve something meaningful for them that really caused a lot of critical thinking, and it required critical thinking and questioning and justifying. And it's both rigorous math and something meaningful.
Mm-hmm. And something from their real lives that they're probably talking about at the dinner table, just like your Malala example. And in talking about water and how water is life, I can't help but think of Flint, Michigan right now in all of this. And I have got to think that there are teachers and students talking about all of the math and that struggle for that community. in their process. So really, it's just like these conversations and these challenges are happening everywhere in all of our communities. And I think it's exciting to explore the possibilities of what we could achieve together when working with teachers and partnering more closely with them to weave all of that together, because it's hard and it does take a lot of support and experience doing that because this justice work and anti-racism work is not something that you can just read one book and put into practice. It's an ongoing process, and you are, again, constantly learning.
Mm-hmm. Constantly listening, constantly reflecting, revising your thinking, and deciding why you believe what you believe and why you behave in the ways that you behave, and then making changes based on all of the different input that you're receiving. And that connects right back to the math classroom, where the math that we're talking about is not just solve 40 practice problems of your multiplications tables, but how do you know that what you're saying is true? Explain your thinking. How does that connect to the thinking of others? How is that different from the thinking of others? Justify what you're saying. Can you see someone else's reasoning and understand it, even if it's not your reasosoning? And then how do you use that to strengthen your own? It's so connected.
Wow. And isn't that skill set such an important skill set in every leader, right? That the ability to ask yourself, am I right? How do I know? Mm-hmm. And then to be able to sit with that self-conversation and any discomfort that might surface in that, and go deeper into the why, because there is a richness there that adds value to all of our lives when you explore it.
Definitely.
I'm wondering if you can share the story from Girls STEM Club about, I always forget what you call it, but it's not a zip line thing you ride in.
Cable car.
Yeah.
The cable car, yes. Yes, so I think this is a good example of being able to see that anti-racist teaching and anti-racist math isn't just for one group of students or one group of teachers or one particular type of community, but it's something that we can all engage in. And we all must engage in different ways. And so, yeah, because when I think about anti-racist teaching, I think not only is anti-racist teaching about ensuring that we're not causing any harm to our students' self-concepts connected to their identities, but we're ensuring that our classrooms are places where there can be both individual and collective flourishing, accepting the full self and the identities of everyone in that space, and how we can coexist in unity. And so that might look different in different contexts, and that's okay. And so when I think about the Girls STEM Club example, so I have had the opportunity to lead a Girls STEM Club in Guayaquil, Ecuador, which has a very different demographic than the community in Onslow, but is actually very connected through an interesting history. And in this Girls STEM Club, an integral piece of programming had to do with Global Math Stories and the Global Math Stories resources that we offer as an organization, free to teachers to be able to use. And I was thinking, okay, what's the first global math story that I wanted to introduce and use as a model for the girls in the club, and also to be able to show this resource to the teachers who were leading the club alongside of me. And so I decided that, what were we hearing about on the news all of the time? We were hearing about Venezuela and migrants from Venezuela who have been moving through Ecuador, some to stay, others to travel on to Peru or Chile. And there's a lot of xenophobia, honestly, against Venezuelans here in Ecuador. And I'm not okay with any of my students having a single story about Venezuela or people from Venezuela. I don't want them to only think about the bad things that they hear on the news or hear some other people say when Venezuela comes to mind. And so we did a story about Venezuela, and we learned about the highest cable car in the world, which exists in Venezuela. And then we were able to connect that to a cable car that exists in the capital of Ecuador, in Quito. and also a really big STEM project currently happening that is the pride of the local government of Guayaquil right now, which is going to serve as public transportation, crossing the river and solving a lot of problems in the community. And so we were able to start by exploring the math happening in Venezuela, connect it to math that currently exists in Ecuador, and then also specifically to the community that we live in Guayaquil. And we were able to build a task out of that where students used raw spaghetti noodles, like the cables for a cable car, and were able to test using a little cup and pennies to see how many pennies could one strand hold, how many pennies could two strands hold. And so we created tables and made charts to be able to show the math and then estimate and say, okay, if two strands can hold this many pennies, how many do you think 10 strands could hold? And there was so much rich math there that we were able to pull out of that, while also giving students something else to think about when they think about Venezuela, and being able to say something about that country connects to my home as well, and just generating more stories that create more critical thinking in their minds.
Yeah. I feel so strongly about that idea after having grown up in Texas my whole life. And then I lived in Guatemala for almost 5 years. And I've only been back in Texas for about 1.5 years. But I think a lot of people have heard about and the same movement of people in the last several years, and a lot of Guatemalans that are now living in Texas. And I too feel really strongly about making sure that there are more than one story, that there's more than one story out there. I think that everybody deserves more than one story, right? Because that's humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I guess you look like you were going to take a breath. I never know on these Zoom calls. Okay. Well, we are just about out of time anyways. But as we wrap up, I just want to thank you for all these stories that you've shared with us. I think one of the hardest parts about our work is that it happens in spaces that we don't always see it, right? Like that today, yesterday, tomorrow, we're working with teachers, and this work is constantly happening. And that, the world is changing a lot right now, and teachers and students are fighting hard to respond. And that if we can all work together and keep working together and supporting each other to support students and teachers as they work against this learning gap, and really work to keep having the hard conversations and keep pulling the real world math into those conversations, then we can change the world. So
yeah,
thanks,
definitely. Thank you.